I wish you would just say this is a terrible video camera. Sony a7R Mark IV. Should you wait for the next Sony camera? Should you upgrade from your older Sony cameras? Or should you just buy this camera if you're brand new to Sony? We're gonna answer all these burning questions in this video. So I feel like other camera channels have already expressed their disappointment that the Sony a7R Mark IV doesn't have 4K 60 and the lack of Sony a7S III announcement. But seeing as how I am the premier source of Sony news for a lot of folks out there, I figured I'd give in my 2 cents and to address some of the concerns as well as clear up a lot of the confusion. So let's talk about the Sony a7S III first and when I think it would be announced. Now, obviously it wasn't announced last week, nor did I expect Sony to announce the Sony a7S III last week. In a lot of my prediction videos from earlier this year and even the end of last year, I expected the Sony a7S to probably come out the end of 2019. Now, I didn't talk to any executives about this. I didn't talk to any engineers about this. This is just based on my premonition and what I think and when I think the Sony a7S III would come out. Now, if you think about it, we still have one more big sort of camera convention taking place before this year ends, and that is PhotoPlus. And that's taking place in New York in October. So I'm thinking that might be when the Sony a7S III could be announced. They would announce it in October. They'll have the pre-orders ready in October and start shipping out the camera the end of November. Again, those are just my thoughts. That's just my prediction. There is no credible source backing up what I'm thinking. But the reason why I think the Sony a7S III might be announced during that time frame is because if we think back to a couple of major camera announcements, the Sony a6500 was announced, I believe, in October 2016, and it was shipped in November 2016. When the Sony a7R Mark III was announced in October 2017, it was shipped in November 2017. So loosely basing on those facts, the Sony a7S III might have that kind of treatment. Announcement in October 2019, shipping in November 2019. But wait, the a7S III could have the potential to be announced at Sony Kondo. For those of you who don't know what Kondo is, it's pretty much a camera camp for creatives. Sony invites out their artisans, their collective members, as well as members of the press to this giant trip where they can co-interact and mingle. And starting last year, they opened up Kondo to the public. But anyways, in the first Kondo trip, they made 3 major announcements: the Sony A9, the Sony G Master 16-35, and the Sony 12-24. That was back in 2017. In 2018, when they had Kondo 2.0, nothing was really announced. But who's to say that they won't announce anything at Sony Kondo 3.0? And honestly, I wouldn't even be surprised if they saved the a7S III announcement to early 2020. Because then in January, we would have CES. But yeah, I wasn't expecting the Sony a7S III to make it to last week's announcement. I was actually expecting the high-end APS-C camera, the so-called a7000 that Sony Alpha rumors have been teasing for the past couple of weeks. But even then, it's just been all speculated rumors. Even the naming convention, the a7000, that's a rumored name. You know, there's no way of knowing how true these rumors are. Sometimes they are crazy, scary accurate, and sometimes they completely miss the mark. And that's the danger of rumors. It creates this false sense of expectation. So when something does finally get announced, but it doesn't have the rumor specs that everybody was anticipating, then of course they will be majorly disappointed. So again, always take rumors with a grain of salt. Again, yes, they can be crazy, scary, accurate, but there are times where it's just, at the end of the day, a rumor. So was I disappointed that it wasn't a Sony a7000? No, absolutely not. But what I will say is that I'm completely surprised by the fact that they are launching the Sony a7R Mark IV before they even announce or release the Sony a7S III. Logically, it would just make sense, right? You have the a7 III already, you have the a7R III already. It makes sense to finally give that third iteration to the S series. But nope, the Sony a7R is now 2 generations ahead of Sony a7S. Which got me thinking, is the Sony a7R the guinea pig for the rest of the Sony Alpha 7 line? Because if we think about it, the Sony a7R III was announced and released before the Sony a7 III, and the Sony a7 series, the plain no R, no S series, is supposed to be the baseline for the rest of the Sony lineup. But the fact that the Sony a7R III was announced and released first with all these new features, those got trickled down to the a7 III. And we're seeing this pattern here for the Sony a7R Mark IV. It's a brand new sensor, it's using a new OLED display for the viewfinder, it has way better reliable autofocus control in low light, it has 2 UHS 2 card slots now, it has real-time eye autofocus tracking for video, you can now use custom prefixes for video file naming, and of course the bigger grip amongst many other things. So if that's the case, then why couldn't they experiment with 4K 60 in the a7R Mark IV? They're already putting in so many of these new features, and why couldn't they bother just putting in 4K 60? I, like many people, was expecting 4K 60 when they are announcing the camera on the spot, and I was disappointed when that wasn't the case. But if we were to think about the root, the sort of the philosophy of the R series, if you will, the a7R was never intended to be a fantastic video camera. It was a fantastic photo camera with video features. Let me explain. To a lot of people who are unfamiliar with the Sony ecosystem, it's of course the camera announcement would totally bum them out. But if we look back at each of the cameras that Sony has in their lineup, it makes sense why the Sony a7R Mark IV doesn't have 4K 60. Let's start off with the A9, Sony's flagship mirrorless camera. The A9 is often regarded as a sports action camera because of its insanely fast and accurate autofocus technology. It is a camera that also had all the standard video features as well, 4K up to 30 frames per second, 1080p up to 120 frames per second. However, the major Achilles heel of the A9 is that it has no picture profiles. But video users wouldn't need to buy the A9 because they can spend less money on the Sony a7 III for the same video features. And it has picture profiles. And Sony really outdid themselves with the a7 III. What was supposedly a standard base prosumer camera, they still made it a very powerful hybrid camera. 24 megapixel stills, fast autofocus in both photos and videos, animal eye autofocus, picture profiles, dual card slots, just to name a few. In fact, the low light capability of the camera is almost on par with the Sony a7S II, and it shared a lot of the same features as the a7R III, minus the high megapixel count and lower screen resolution. Now moving on to the R and S models, there was always a clear and distinct difference between the two. R stands for resolution, hence the high megapixel count. S stands for sensor, which meant it had an advanced sensor for low light. While Sony never officially differentiated one to be strictly a stills camera and one to be a strictly video camera, it was very obvious based on the specs. Going back to the 2 series camera, the Sony a7R II was capable of 4K up to 30 frames per second, but no S-Log 3 picture profile, and the 120 frames per second was capped at 720p. The Sony a7S II, on the other hand, was also capable of 4K up to 30 frames per second, but also capable of 120 frames per second at 1080p with the S-Log 3 picture profile. However, the a7S II lacked the hybrid autofocus, so the autofocus on that camera was much slower compared to the R. And for stills, it was only limited to 12 megapixels. So after seeing the specs of the a7S II, the a7R II clearly had a few but important video features held back. So basing off the history of these models, I hope it makes more sense now why the a7R IV wouldn't have 4K 60p, and we can expect the best video features, including 4K 60p, to appear on the a7S III. So yeah, hopefully that clears up the confusion and concerns about the Sony a7R IV lacking the video expectation of things. And again, I don't think the video features of the a7R IV is terrible. I mean, if you think about it, real-time eye autofocus in video mode, holy cow! And now you can use an external monitor, shoot in 4K, and have face detection working, and eye detection working, and the screen doesn't turn off when you're shooting. Those are 2 major video updates to the Sony a7R Mark IV, and we can totally expect those to happen on the a7 Mark IV and the a7S Mark III. By the way, many comments in the previous videos ask if Sony would update the 3 series to have a few of the same software items as the 4, such as saving custom user profiles, focus frame colors. Now, there were no official statement from Sony, but unfortunately, I wouldn't have my hopes on it. Other features, especially technical features like real-time eye autofocus for video, those would not be possible on the 3 series cameras. So let's move on to the next topic. Should you even upgrade to the Sony a7R Mark IV, whether it be from the R3 or the R2 or even the Sony a7 III? Now, I personally myself will be upgrading to the Sony a7R Mark IV. I've always been fond of the a7R series. I personally think it's the most versatile and the best hybrid camera in Sony's lineup. The high megapixel count allows you to be very flexible when you're shooting and when you're post-processing. In full frame, the a7R Mark IV has 61 megapixels for you to work with, but when you crop into Super 35 mode, you have 26 megapixels to work with. 26 megapixels, that's a whole APS-C camera in your full frame camera. And the Super 35 mode feature is not new to Sony, it's just that when you use Super 35 mode on the a7 III, you're dropping from 24 megapixels to just 10 megapixels. When you have only 10 megapixels, you don't really have much pixels to work with, therefore you can't crop as much, and less pixels for you to sample off of. But with that 26 megapixels in APS-C mode, we have a lot more flexibility when we're shooting photos. We can use Super 35 mode to squeeze out an extra bit of distance out of our lenses, which I go more into details in this video up here. Not only do you have that flexibility in photography, but you also have that flexibility in video mode. And not only that, but the a7R can shoot 4K in both full frame and Super 35 mode. And that was the advantage that the a7R II had over the a7S II at the time. The a7S II cannot shoot 4K in Super 35 mode, whereas the a7R II can shoot 4K in both modes. On top of that, the Mark IV has real-time eye autofocus in video as well, which is pretty insane, and you can also select which eye the camera should focus on. And I haven't tested this myself yet, but the camera supposedly has a more reliable autofocus in low light. Aside from that, the a7R Mark IV has more autofocus points now, 567 of them spread across the screen, and the camera is capable of taking 61 megapixels at 10 frames per second. That to me is pretty good because I love shooting concert photography, and to get 61 megapixel stills at concerts while there's high-speed action going on, that's pretty dope to me. But that's just me. I do realize that the a7R Mark IV may not be worth the upgrade for everybody else. Especially if you're an a7 III user, you're probably screaming 61 megapixels? Why on earth do I need 61 megapixels? 24 megapixels is more than enough. Especially if you're an event or wedding shooters, if you're shooting over 1,000 photos, those 61 megapixels per still will add up. And it's gonna take you even longer to process on your computer. You're gonna need more hard drive space, bigger SD cards. It's probably not gonna be worth it for you. And if you're a video shooter, I would say just wait for the a7S III. I mean, all these features that they have on the a7R Mark IV, all these brand new video features, will likely get trickled down to the a7 Mark IV and the a7S Mark III. So unfortunately, just wait a little longer. And if you own a previous a7R camera, should you upgrade to the a7R Mark IV? If you have no issues whatsoever with your a7R Mark III, the autofocus doesn't bother you in any way, then I don't think you really have to. The reason why you would upgrade to the a7R Mark IV is if you do a lot of portraits, you could really take advantage of the eye selection and the real-time eye autofocus tracking. That, in my opinion, would be worth the upgrade. Plus, if you record to 2 memory cards, it might be worth getting the a7R Mark IV for its 2 UHS 2 card slots. And there are various other things if you're an a7R shooter to consider if you want to upgrade to the a7R Mark IV. I mean, the a7R Mark IV is rocking a new sensor, it has a low vibration shutter, it has the new OLED display through the viewfinder, so it's a lot more clear than what you're used to on the a7R Mark III. If you shoot in burst mode a lot, it will write in the photos a lot faster. It has more autofocus points, 567 versus 399. It has the bigger battery grip. And the image culling process in camera is a lot better. You can choose to skip over 10 photos or 100 photos while you're cycling through the photos. You can even sort by rated photos too. So for example, if you shot 100 photos and you start 25 photos, you can just go through those 25 star photos instead of all of your 100 photos again just to find the ones that you've starred. And there are many more new features and upgraded features that I cannot possibly go over in this already long video. So I have it here on the screen, but I'll also link to the official product page in case you want to check it out for yourself. So yeah, a7R Mark IV may not be for everybody. Just weigh in your pros and cons with the current Sony setup that you have right now and see whatever new features that got introduced in the a7R Mark IV will be worth it to you or not. Moving on to the last topic of this video, and for those of you who've been shooting Sony for a while now, please help me out here. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of this. But for somebody who's never shot Sony before, they want to get in and they want to buy a high megapixel camera, would the Sony a7R Mark IV be a great option for them? In my opinion, absolutely. You're getting the latest and greatest features on the Sony a7R Mark IV that just makes shooting photos and videos a breeze. I think I already talked about a lot of the autofocusing feature throughout this video, so I'm not gonna reiterate them again. But the one big thing that I haven't mentioned yet in this video is the bigger grip on the Sony a7R Mark IV. Believe it or not, a lot of people complain about the smaller mirrorless body size when they switch over from a Canon or Nikon to a Sony. When they grip onto a Sony, their pinky has nothing to rest on. That's why Sony had to sell this Sony pinky grip for like $100. But yeah, that is a legitimate concern. With the Sony a7R Mark IV, they did improve on the grip. You can actually grip the entire camera body without worrying about your pinky going loose. It sounds silly, it sounds like it's a small thing, but believe me, there are a lot of people who told me they refuse to shoot with Sony because of that reason. Aside from that, 61 megapixels at 10 frames per second, 15 stops of dynamic range. If you've always been curious about Sony and you want that high megapixel count, I think the Sony a7R Mark IV will be a fantastic choice for you. But if you're looking to save on some money, the a7R Mark III will do the job just fine. And if you just want a high megapixel camera sub $1,500, the a7R II is still a fantastic choice. Anyways, this video is getting super long, but hopefully I cleared up a lot of confusion and a lot of concerns about the Sony a7R Mark IV. So let's go ahead and look forward to the Sony a7S III whenever that gets announced. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.